Good afternoon. I'm Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this latest session of our Meet the Author series. And today we're meeting with Mike Albertson, who's the Deputy Director of CGSR and the author of a new Livermore paper entitled Negotiating with Putin's Russia, Lessons Learned from a Lost Decade of Bilateral Arms Control. Would you like to say a little bit more about what brought you to your work on this particular subject, arms control with Russia?
Yeah, so the generation of this project was a couple of talks I gave actually at CGSR workshops a few years ago, as people were trying to explore sort of the next steps in arms control with President Putin and this Russian negotiating partner. And one of those presentations was on how Putin views strategic stability, and how that may or may not be different from how the US views strategic stability. And then the other was sort of an evolution of Putin's thinking over time on the arms control subject. What he said, sort of what was immediately visible, and then how he had approached the subject when dealing with the Americans. So sort of those two proposals became the basis for a couple of the chapters in this work, and then it was just adding a bit of reading material and experiences to that to form this project.
Thank you. How are you describing the importance and timely quality of this publication?
I think you have a really interesting moment right now with the extension of the New START Treaty. I mean, on the one hand, you have a lot of rejoicing because you have 5 more years of this agreement and therefore 5 more years to get to the next arms control treaty. So you have half the people out there saying, boy, look at all the time we have. And then on the other hand, you see how difficult it was to extend an agreement that both sides were complying with and theoretically was in both sides' national security interest. In the past, this would have been a no-brainer, but in this case, it was something that both the U.S. and Russia at various points in the last 5 years have tried to use extension of this treaty as leverage for other things. It came under fire for not doing things that were not actually in the agreement itself. And that should be kind of a clear wake-up call to the field that whatever comes next is going to be difficult. So you also get a sense of, boy, this is going to be really, really hard. In terms of why it's so timely right now, you have 5 years. It's time to do reflection, and the first reflection that there should be is, don't jump upon the immediate impulses that you've jumped on for the last 10 years. In the first case, the U.S. needs to buck its past negotiating tendencies. I mean, you have a list of stated Russian issues, Russian preconditions. They're out there. They haven't changed much. And over the last 2 decades of experiences with Putin, the U.S. side is quick to develop proposals. It's what we think the Russians will accept or should accept. A U.S. official says, well, I'll take this proposal. I'll create a relationship with my counterpart in Moscow. I'll explain the proposal to them, and they'll understand it and accept it. And the Russians consistently reject the proposals. And then the next step is, well, we need to explain this in a different way so the Russians understand. So we'll give them more objective data, or we'll give them assurances of why we don't have any nefarious intent. The Russians reject that as well. And then somebody else in the U.S. government, probably more senior, says, well, if I just go and explain this proposal to the Russians, they'll understand because it's coming from me now, and they'll know that I'm a senior person, and so it matters. And then the Russians still reject it, and that just leaves everybody feeling on the U.S. side sort of tired, dejected, and in the same place where they started, having to expend a lot of energy. And then in the second case, there's a sort of standard list of assumptions about dealing with Putin on these issues that I think are overdue for correction. This idea that he values being at the table with the Americans, that he views bilateral arms control as a special shared relationship that the U.S. and Russia have a place in, that he really values, ceremonies with special pens and summits, and he's willing to trade things for them, or that he can be sort of threatened into an arms race, like the Soviets were at the end of the Cold War. Simply put, he hasn't behaved as people thought he would or think he should, even when there are cases where it looks like it's in Russia's interest to agree to something or take a proposal. So I think, it's a strong need to sort of step back from those two immediate impulses and do a little thought.
Thank you. And you having stood back and engaged in a lot of thought on this topic, how have you come to think of the main messages for your readership on these questions?
Well, I mean, I think first the current trajectory for arms control to me is unsustainable, and I view that as a person who, sitting here 10 years later, you recognize that 2010, 2011 was sort of the last time when the generation of the 80s and 90s was really engaged on arms control issues. You had the Senator Lugers of the world in the Senate. You had people who'd been doing compliance and implementation for 30 years, making their last trip to Geneva. All of those people are gone now. They're out of the field. They're retired. You've been through a decade with a lot of destruction, but without a lot of creation in the arms control world. You're dealing with a lot more external challenges in the bilateral relationship than you were, and you have a really difficult negotiating partner. So, things have to change, or arms control is not going to be around. And to me, the way that's most useful for us to try to change that trajectory is to gain a better understanding of the other side of the table. And that, in this case, means President Putin. It's a system he created. He stands at the top. He makes the decisions at the end of the day. And so his formative experience with arms control, how his views have hardened over time, how he feels his interests have been ignored, how arms control is a part of his mindset on nuclear deterrence and strategic stability affairs. All of this has to be factored into the equation. And some of these are very consistent with historical Soviet Russian views on the subject, and some are unique to Putin and his experiences. And it's important to know where those two things lie and what the similarities and differences are. But you have to understand and take into account his mindset if you have any hope of success in getting a proposal that you and the U.S. interagency have worked hard on getting it off the launching pad. And then, on the U.S. side of the table, the message is that, things have been pretty easy over the last few decades. You've had a very clear path of what you needed to do, numerical reductions of launchers and warheads. You didn't have to put a lot of creative thought into what are our interests that we want to get at the negotiating table? What are we really trying to achieve with arms control? Because it was evident. Now that's changed. Arms control could go off in a number of different directions, and you need to put a lot of time and energy into the sort of the negotiating homework, negotiating framework analysis to sketch out what your interests are, what the interests of the other side are, and how do you balance those two things as you try to negotiate with them to come to an agreement.
So we have to understand both sides of the table, and your new publication is largely about the Russian side of the table. Tell our listeners a little bit about what work you now have underway that's aimed at helping the American side understand its side of the table.
No, so it's very much sort of a back to basics approach that I think people did, for example, in the 1960s and the 1970s, that has sort of faded away over time, and it's coming up with a list of, what are the key things we're trying to address in arms control now? Is it asymmetries in numbers? Is it problems in intentions and doctrine? Is it misperceptions? What are the central challenges that you're trying to solve and trying to correct? Because I think people take a position without necessarily examining the interest behind that position. And what I mean when I say that is, people are concerned about Russian tactical nuclear warheads. What are you concerned about with Russian tactical nuclear warheads? Is it the numbers? Is it the locations? Is it you feel the Russians would use them in a conflict? There are a lot of different ways to get at whatever problem you find with an arms control tool, but you need to be sure that you've found the right problem before you start first exploring the arms control tools.
You're muted, Brad.
Thank you. Mike, that's a very interesting and useful introduction to your new publication. Is there anything you'd like to add in closing?
So, to make an analogy, during the last year, my son and I have watched a lot of documentaries about big construction projects. And it's amazing how much time in these documentaries is spent not actually building the thing, but preparing the ground. How much time they have to spend, clearing the site, bringing in the dirt, packing the dirt down, building the foundation before whatever beautiful bridge or office building or whatever they're constructing goes up. And I think that, there's a lot of work that can be done now, independent of a proposal in the U.S. interagency, and in sort of the technical community here at the lab. And I'd urge people to get started on these kinds of things. And I'll just identify some here now while I have the opportunity. I mean, one is to get smart on the practical literature on negotiations, because that gives you a lot of good information on how to frame things and structure these things going forward. Doing more research in the interests, motivations, and mindset of the other side of the table, which this paper gets a little bit at. Take an opportunity to learn from the great arms control negotiators who've been there and done that in terms of the tactics of the other side. I think there's a lot of work that be done in building the nuclear arms control IQ in Congress. They're going to need to be brought in as partners in this process at some point. I mean, this used to be a very cooperative process, and there's no reason why it can't be again. And then the last thing I'd recommend is, for the technical community, start working on the tools now, start socializing the tools now that you're going to use with the other side. So when the negotiators get to the table, you already have an agreed set of equipment that you're going to use, and that doesn't become a bone of contention at the negotiating table. So those are my thoughts on the future, and I very much appreciate this time to talk about the paper, Brad.
Good thoughts on the future. Thank you. Thank you for sharing them. Thanks everybody for joining us. Let me commend you a visit to our website and a downloading of Negotiating with Putin's Russia, Lessons Learned from a Lost Decade of Bilateral Arms Control. Thank you for joining us. At this point, we'll stand adjourned. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Brad.